Before we move on to the new poem, we're going to practice our recall from the previous poem as imperceptibly as grief. Let's just go over the key words for the key quotes for that poem. Summer, twilight, escape. Practice your recall of these three key words before we move on to recalling the quotes on the next slide. Now you're on to the next step. Let's see if you can use the key words to trigger the whole quote. Once you've done that and are good at it, see if you can use the key words first of all to trigger the quote and then to trigger the story of the whole poem. Well done. Now you're ready to move on to the next poem. Here's some things to think about before we start to read the poem. First of all, if you live with someone, what sort of things would remind you of them? And also, if you knew there was a big storm or hurricane coming, what would this make you think about? Follow the link on this page to hear the poem read aloud. I always find I need to hear a poem at least twice before I start to understand it. Now we're going to write for 10 minutes about the poem. Whenever we write about a poem, we always start by telling the story. What's the poem about? We think about the who, when, what, and where, and we explain the story. There are some notes on the next slide to help you with this, and you can use information that you've already discovered on previous slides. But remember, at this point, we're only explaining the story of the poem. Now, having explained the story of the poem, we're going to go back to the poem as a whole and find three important things that we're going to focus on. We'll need three quotes to support what we're saying and to help retell that story in greater detail. Now we're going to look at what actually happens in the poem, the story of the poem, and how Dove describes the love she feels for Fred. At the beginning, the poem looks almost like a letter, as she uses the words for Fred to dedicate it to her husband. She explains how even really ordinary things like a lamp remind her of Fred, and also goes on to talk of images of heroes and arrows to a heart, showing that the sort of love her and Fred have isn't a fantasy, but it's actually real love. These are the three quotes that I've selected. I've selected them because I feel they tell an important part of the story of the poem. For each quote, I've picked out a key word. That key word's really important because it'll trigger the whole quote in my mind. For example, the word flat will trigger the quote, "Nothing is flat or parallel." I'll practice remembering the key word and I'll practice remembering the whole quote. Eventually, that whole quote and that key word will trigger the story of the poem in my mind and help me remember everything that happens in the poem Living Space. Have a look at the detail on this slide. Look at the red comments that explain why this quote is important to me. Once you've done that and thought about it, go back to the previous slide, practice your recall, use the trigger words, cover the quote, see if you can remember the quote, see if you can remember why it's important to the poem as a whole. Now we've selected our quotes, it's time to start writing about the poem again. We're going to develop paragraphs using our quotes as evidence to explain the story. And the next 3 slides will walk you carefully through this process. It's now time to conclude our writing on the poem. We need to think about the why of the poem. And in order to do this, we need to ask ourselves 3 questions. First of all, why did the poet write this poem? What's the poet telling us about the poor? And what does the poet want us to learn about poverty and the way poor people live? On the next slide, there are some hints to help you with this section. Here are some ideas for your conclusion. Remember, it doesn't have to be long. It should only take you about 5 minutes. You just need to sum up what we learn from reading this poem. Now, read through your response to this poem. If you have a green pen, use it now. Read carefully, slowly, and correct and improve as you go. Before we finish our work on this poem, try practicing your recall again. Remember, first use the key words, then once you've used the key words, try and remember the whole quote, and then finally, try and use the key words to trigger the story of the poem. Well done! You've now completed your response to the poem Living Space by Imtiaz Darker. Keep this response ready for next year, and whenever you've got a free moment, practice your recall of the 3 key words and see if you can remember the quotes, and then of course see if you can remember the story of the poem.